Let's do this. It is good to see you all here. How, let's take a deep breath. It doesn't feel fair to say, how are you today? So let's just take a deep breath and feel the goodness of each other's faces. Just allow wherever we are, whatever we have been thinking about in the last hour, the last 15 minutes, the last 10 minutes, to just allow ourselves to know that we're going to get some Torah, and that Torah is the there's a publication, I think it's through Chabad or something, it's called Torah Ora or something like that, which is the Torah is light. And so amidst the darkness around us, amidst the Hanukkah lights that we're going to kindle tomorrow night, I hope that we find true light within us. It is so good. There's even folks who haven't been here in a few weeks, months, and it's so good to see so many of you here. For those who can't be in with a video, that is totally fine. But we hope that if you can join and be present, we'd love to see your faces. So the past two sessions, we have spoken about Shabbat in the context of looking at our Friday night table rituals. So first we looked at candles, and we invoked this idea of the blessing and gift of Shabbat that we are bringing in when we kind of both physically bring our hands in, but that's what we're doing when we light candles. And then we talked about the kiddush, the wine, and we left this with this idea that if we hold it like a rose, with a cup, with our fingers around the cup, that we're transmitting this creation and for being sort of the fulfillment of God's rest on Shabbat. And then tonight, last but not least, certainly, is Khala. And so tonight I want to look at the origins of Khala, what it is, and what we can learn from it, if anything, and maybe a couple of ritual pieces to deepen your Shabbat observance around it, as we did for candles and as we did for wine. So for those of you who shared in the wine exercise, I'm curious if that's changed for you over the past few weeks. I know I've seen a few of you on Friday night hold your Kiddush cup in a particular way. And I wonder if actually holding the Kiddush cup does anything, when we do things differently, like you brush your teeth with your left hand, for me, it's like weird, but if you, if you change the way you do something very often, I'm curious if it did anything for you intellectually. Yeah, Susan.
Well, I think of some of the readings that we read about Kiddush. Yeah. And one thing that stuck with me is remember that I led you out of Egypt. And so it reminds me that we couldn't always celebrate Shabbat when we were slaves, and that we have the freedom to do it now. And that freedom is a privilege. We shouldn't take it for granted. So
great. Thank you. Nancy.
I was going to say something like Susan said. It reminds me of the freedom, but I don't drink wine. But when I hold my glass of water, whatever it is, at the time when everyone is saying Kiddush, I think of the freedom, and it's just the consciousness of doing something different that makes me, and that brings me some awareness. And I watch to see, of the people who I can see holding their Kiddush cups, if there's anyone from class, and if they're holding it that way. I notice that you do now, Philip, all the time.
Thank you. Anyone else? Great, Danny.
Philip, I just want to echo what you said, which I think you've already said it, which is this process of doing something differently feels very intentional and powerful. And so it's a little awkward. It's a little hard to hold the cup that way, especially if you do it from the bottom as opposed to from the cup itself. But I think it really does make you think, oh, like I'm doing this thing now, and we learned something about it. And I'm not sure I fully understand it, but yet the act of trying to do it is sort of connected in a lovely way. So thank you.
So you put like a little hiccup or a speed bump in the ritual, so that doesn't become so rote. And then when that thing becomes fixed in some capacity, then we shake it up again and find something else. Yeah, Susan, go ahead.
I just wanted to say, if you hold the cup from the bottom and you think of the rose as was described, and you think of the beauty of rose petals, it just brings a whole different view and meaning and beauty into the ritual that I just never thought of before.
Great. Yeah. So there are, I mean, like everything, I mean, also there's so many, I mean, I love the idea of a rose for lots of different reasons, because if you grab the bottom, right, you can poke your hands. But if you see the top, there's just such a yin and yang to it, and to be able to hold that, you know, moving from the chaos of the week, or chol, as it were, the regular to the sacred, it feels very, that you can be in between. That is a powerful thing to be able to hold. So wonderful. So tonight we're going to look at Challah. So I'm curious to know if anybody has a ritual around Challah that they have right now. Yeah, Carol.
So this is going to sound a little silly. Please don't laugh. But in this COVID world, I find that since I'm home, I'm baking so much more, and baking breads and baking challah. And I'm much more aware of that incredibly wonderful odor and smell that comes from fresh baked bread. So I think my ritual has changed a little bit in that I'm so much more sensitive to the aroma of the breads that I'm baking these days, and that will stick with me.
That is certainly not silly or funny. That is beautiful. That is beautiful.
I would just add, we go through the same ritual, Carol. We are baking every week. And the aroma and the feel of the dough is amazing.
Great. Who else is anybody else baked challah over the last 9 months? A few. That's great. Okay, for like like this was like a new thing, or yeah, that's great. Anybody else have a ritual around challah? Either now, Gloria.
So my father was born in New York, but his family was from Ukraine, and he would always take the piece of challah and he would dip it into the Shabbos wine and then eat the wet challah. And I do that, and I do it at temple, and I'll do it again when we go back to the Kiddush. And anyone seeing me do that say, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why are you dipping the challah into the wine? I said, try it. It's really good. It's so funny. I'm not even aware. You just give it to me and I'll look. I would dip it in Diet Pepsi. You know, just so that's
so interesting. I'm actually not super familiar with that ritual, that particular ritual. That may be something of your family, but there are definitely other dipping rituals which we'll talk about tonight with challah, certainly. But that one is new to me. Matzo ball soup, yes. Wine, less so. So we'll get back there. Great. Margie.
I learned that my grandmother, who I never met, who I was named for, was in Russia, and during the revolution, and there were a lot of poor Jews, and she would bake 30 to 40 challahs on Thursday night. She'd be up all night, and her children would deliver them anonymously to the homes of poor Jews in the area. And then much later in life, I ran family table, and we delivered a challah at every distribution to every home. So that was just really powerful for me.
I was hoping that that we would explore a Hasidic text tonight, but I don't know if we're going to get to it. And the takeaway of a lot of them is that Shabbat is not complete, that you complete it with the Challah, right? So that is it's a beautiful thing that you said your grandmother, your great-grandmother? Grandmother did that, and then also that you helped facilitate that as well. That's beautiful. Marlene.
Yes, my mother used to say a prayer in Yiddish, I guess, to her mother before she made the challah, for her to bless the challah. And now when I make challah, I say a prayer in English to my mother for her to bless the challah. And when my granddaughter was here baking challah with me, she said it to her grandmother, me.
That's really sweet. I like that. What was the blessing, if you don't mind me asking?
I don't remember. It was in Yiddish.
Oh, okay.
Just that, she would bless the challah and the house and things like that.
That's sweet. Great. All right, let's take one more. Carol Shelley, and then we'll hop into our text.
My dad every Friday night would always tear up the challah, but then put salt on it before he ate it. And I was fascinated in the reading that you sent out that you're supposed to put the challah into the salt rather than.
Yeah, we'll get there. We'll get there. Yes, that is our dipping. We'll get there. Okay, Shelley. Oh, you're muted.
Now, I don't bake challah now, but I was a challah baker. And every year for 25 years, Dorothy and I would go to Chautauqua Institution. Often we stayed in this rooming house where we shared a kitchen, and I would bake challah there on Friday in the afternoon. And in addition to having it for our own use and for the service that was held later outside at the institution, I used to cut up some challah for all of the Gentiles who were sharing this rooming house with us. And many of them loved it and insisted on the recipe and went home with it and said, this is the bread that they're going to break from now on. So, spreading joy throughout the world.
Spreading joy in French toast. It's great. So, wonderful. So, okay, so let's look at these texts. I forgot to include our blessing for studying Torah. If you have them, I invite you to pull them out or look alongside them. Otherwise, I'll place them on the screen. But let's see the blessing for studying Torah together, which ends la'asok b'divrei Torah. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right, so we have our first of a few different biblical texts tonight, looking at what is Challah and where does it come from, what's it all about. So would somebody read these 3-4 verses from the book of Numbers? Jerry, thank you.
Okay. The Lord spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land to which I am taking you, and you eat of the bread of the land, you shall set some aside as a gift to the Lord. As the first yield of your baking, you shall set aside a loaf as a gift. You shall set it aside as a gift, like the gift from the threshing floor. You shall make a gift to the Lord from the first yield of your baking throughout the ages." The first tzedakah.
Okay. So you see here, if you can follow along in the Hebrew, right. It says here, you see the word challah. You see that? You should set aside, it says loaf, right? Loaf, they're translating from the word challah in Hebrew. So here's my question. What is this saying about challah, and why is the land of Israel and Khala so interconnected in these verses? What does the land and Khala have to do with each other? First, what's happening here, and then we can explore the question.
I think it says that you have to put in perspective where it all comes from.
Okay.
That
Can you say another word?
The Khala comes from the wheat, and the wheat comes from the land, and it's all been given to us by God.
Okay, great. So that we have to really recognize exactly where it's coming from. Thank you, Howard. Other thoughts? Deborah.
I also think that it's sort of a physical act of partnership, that God's giving us the land, created the land, the wheat, but we need to add our effort in there to make it into bread. And after our effort in this partnership, we give some of it back to Adonai. So it's that wonderful covenant.
Great. Thank you. Other thoughts? Why this land, Ronnie?
Well, I'm thinking that both the land and the bread are nurturing. This is a place that we've come to be filled up with the land of the Lord. It's going to fill us up, and the bread is nurturing too. But it is something that we also have to give back, because we have been well fed, well nurtured, and so we have to share it back to the one who has bestowed it upon us.
Wonderful. Okay, so Ross and then Jerry, and then we're going to talk about what Challah actually is.
So I just wanted to say that if you have grain to make bread, that means you're an agricultural person. You have land. And before entering the land of Canaan, the Israelites did not have land. They were basically living in the desert, wandering. They didn't own land. They weren't able to raise crops. And certainly as in Egypt, they weren't during the slavery. So the connection between entering the land is that you now have property. You now are owners of property. You can grow wheat, you can make bread, and it's your own. So it's very symbolic of owning the land.
Right, which gives us pride, joy, and sort of if you're working it, right? If you own it, you're working it. If you're working it, you need to rest. In the context of Shabbat, it's more connected in that way too. In
addition, I just want to say, you can't really have a society if you are you're wandering around in tribal structures. It's only when you get land and you have that's when you have the ability to form a society, a community. Nice. Stuart.
Yeah, I was just thinking of the connection to the sacrifices of the temple, because I seem to remember that there were 2 loaves set aside every week for a temple offering, and it kind of goes. It again takes the ritual of the temple and makes it more accessible in the time after the temple no longer existed.
Absolutely. And we also know that certain sorts of wheats and certain grains were also included in those offerings regularly and periodically as well. Great, thank you, Stuart. So Jerry and Shelley.
Well, I'm thinking of the concept that bread is the staff of life, and what God said to Moses is, I'm giving you life, and life is this bread. But in order to earn that bread and have that life, you need to give back as well. So to me, that is the concept of tzedakah. And it's you gain something so that you can live, but you must also give it back so that others can live.
That's incredible. I really like that. Have you ever thought when you've taken a bite of challah that this is me participating in this righteous act of giving, and I need to give, right? That I say that without you needing to answer. But
no, and if it's got raisins in it, I want more as well.
Exactly. You know, so that's these are things we don't think about. At least I haven't thought about. So this is exactly why we're exploring this. So thank you, Jerry. Shelley.
Yeah, I connected with what Stuart said about how giving God some of the baking, and he requires it, he demands it, in fact, and the rituals, etc. So I can give explanations for that, but I am certainly no rabbi. And so what I don't really understand is, why does God need these things from us? Why give them to God, or not, you know, as was just said, give them to charity, give them to tzedakah. Why? God doesn't need tzedakah. So what is it? What's the rabbinical explanation for why God needs to get these things from us, whether they be sacrifices or gifts?
Well, if we assume, it's a great question. Does somebody else want to answer before I jump in? Nancy, please.
I don't think that God needs to get them. I just think that we need to give them.
Yeah.
Does that change anything for you, Shelley?
No, because we could give them, as I said, that you can give, if God commands us to give 10% of everything we bake to tzedakah and to other people, I can understand that. But the specific question is, why specifically give it to God? Giving to people who are poor or hungry is giving. Giving to God is got nothing to do with hunger. It's got to do with something. And so I can explain something, but my explaining it would be inferior to, I'm sure, to what our Rabbi Phil can tell us.
Well, I don't know if that's true, but here's what I think, which may be radical, I guess. That what if we imagined the giving of these things to God? Well, on one hand, there's we do these things for God because if for some of us, if we didn't have that motivation, maybe we wouldn't do it in the first place. And so on some level, there's this desire to needing to do mitzvot or good things because theologically that sets up our place in the world. That is certainly one vantage point. What if we thought, though, let's say the 10% or a gift of Khala to someone else was in fact giving it to somebody who is sacredly created in the image of God. And when we give gifts to others who are in need or whatever, in a sense, we are doing that thing of giving to God, right? If that's motivating you. Like if that's fulfilling a certain sense of motivation in your life. But for some others, that's not necessarily going to be a motivating or driving factor. Is that helpful to you? Anybody else want to jump in on that? Gareth, and then
maybe giving the challah to God is not physically giving bread. Maybe it is giving sustenance in other ways to someone else. So think of it as a spiritual giving, not a physical giving.
I like that too. I think the challenge, Gareth, I think I like that today. I think the challenge is it was so tangible biblically. And so at what point does it transfer? It transferred for the rabbis liturgically in prayer, right? They moved from offerings that were physical to a spiritual offering. So in that sense, we actually have a model for the way that works. So I like that a lot. Thank you. Deborah and Carol, and then we'll hop in. We'll move on.
Yeah, I would want to say something similar to what Gareth said, that it's a way to try and connect with something beyond ourselves, to try and connect with this transcendent something of God, the same way the animal sacrifice was. You put your hand on the head of the calf it's this life and death situation, and that it's that connection to the mysterious, awe-inspiring greatness of God. And so this is a similar kind of way to have a more spiritual connection.
Great, thank you. Carol, anything else?
Yeah, I just wanted to connect the challah to the manna, that we got manna for 40 years in the wilderness, and that sustained us. That kept us alive for 40 years. And on Fridays, we collect a double portion. And it links back to me to having the challah as a sustenance and not baking on Saturday, having a double portion as well, but also to the idea, I'm losing it now for a minute, but to the idea that that God kept us alive with the manna, and that as we break off part of the dough from the challah before it's baked and we reuse, we keep it, that becomes the beginning of the next batch of dough, that we're continuing that tradition of staying alive over many decades and remembering that God kept us alive until we got to the promised land.
Great, thank you. So you just said a lot of things that some of which we're gonna touch on. The one thing I did, so thank you. The one thing I just did want to say is that challah and the baking of challah, and Marlene, this may actually be kind of go back to the Yiddish blessing. There is actually a blessing of separation. That challah comes from a Hebrew word that could mean like to split up or to be torn apart or to separate. You're supposed to, from the dough, remove a small piece, say the blessing on the piece, that thing that you've separated is actually the challah itself. The rest of it's just special bread, which you've sanctified in some sense, but it is just bread. And actually the tradition that I understand is not that you retain it for the next week, but actually that you burn it, which in and of itself is like a burnt offering to God, that you would wrap it up in a piece of tin foil and cook it at a very high heat, and you'd leave it in the oven until the challah is done, and in the end it would be discarded. That's what I understand. Anyways, let's move on. All these things are going to build on all the questions that we're going to explore in the end. Okay. So let's go on to the second text from Exodus. Somebody want to read this?
I'll
Eddie.
read.
Oh, okay.
Oh, all right. And the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread for you from the sky, and the people shall go out and gather each day that day's portion, that I may thus test them, to see whether they will follow my instructions or not. But on the sixth day, when they apportion what they have brought in, it shall prove to be double the amount they gather each day.
Great. So here we have, exactly what Carol was just talking about, but the explicit, every day the Israelites went out and got manna. On Shabbat, on Erev Shabbat, on Friday, as it were, they got a second loaf, which is why in traditional circles, you learn of something called lechem mishneh, which means the second loaf. And it is why in some more traditional circles, you'll see challah for Shabbat is 2 challahs instead of 1. Representative of that second challah or second manna that was set in the wilderness. So the question for me is, what is the same and what is the difference between manna and challah? Anybody have an idea? Nancy?
Well, manna is total, this is just off the top of my head.
Yeah.
I haven't thought about it. Manna is totally a gift. You don't have to work anything. You don't have to gather anything. It's a gift. It also is very transitory. It doesn't last more than the one day for which you're given it, except on Shabbat. And so it differs in those 2 ways. It differs, I think, probably more.
I like that. I like that a lot. The other thing I've been thinking about is that manna in the biblical context represents abundance, right? It's there. When I sit down and have challah, at least on Friday night, on a regular basis, abundance isn't necessarily the thing that I think about. And so I wonder, when we eat challah on Friday night, and maybe you do, but I'm curious to know, what is it that you think about when you eat the challah? Phyllis, you just leaned forward.
And
So
my is that obvious, huh? My grandmother used to say that back in Russia, they had to bake black bread for other days, but challah was special, abundant. If you had white flour, you only used it for challah. And my mother-in-law from Poland would say the same thing. She was raised in one of the shtetls before the war, and she said, we only had black bread, but on Shabbat, we only had challah because it was really special and we were lucky to have it. Because the white flour was abundance for them.
I didn't realize that. That makes a lot of sense, though. Yeah, thank you. Howard.
The difference between manna and challah, too, manna is given to you in its form. Challah is something that we have to create, which is reflective of taking something that God has given us and turning it into something.
Right. In some sense, manna is something that, or at least for Shabbat, it was something that you had to save up, right? So in some sense, when we eat challah, we could think about, what have we saved up? What goodness have we saved up for the week? And how are we sharing it when we participate in eating this challah, if they're connected? So that's another thing that we could think about. So the question to me then is, if challah and manna are connected, and we have 2 chalot on Shabbat, or you have one, whatever practice you have, if challah could be representative of abundance instead of scarcity, if challah could be representative of our connection to sustenance, if challah could be all of these different things, what can challah be made from? Right? Challah couldn't just be anything. So let's look at the Mishnah. 5 things are obligated in challah. Dough that must be set aside for the priest. Wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. These are obligated in challah, and they join with each other to complete the minimum measurement required for challah. And they are forbidden as chadash, grain from the current year that one is forbidden to eat until the Omer. There's in Jewish agricultural law, all the first grains you would dedicate, and then you could use the special barley offering offered the day after Passover, which permits grain harvested in the last year to be eaten, is brought. The last part's not particularly relevant to our conversation, but challah can only be wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. Is that news? Could it be anything else?
Does that imply you have to have all of those?
No.
So it's made from any of those?
Any of those.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I'm not sure. I can't really think of what else it could be, except for you cannot have cornbread. Cornbread, for example, would fall outside of the Mishnaic understanding of what challah is. I'm trying to think of anything else. Does that make sense? So the great question, which I did not look up the tshuva on, is, can you make motzi? Can you bless challah on Shabbat with gluten-free bread? Right, so that is our 21st century question. Certainly the answer is going to come out with yes, but I actually need to go look up. I should have in preparation for tonight, but looked up at what the tshuvot are that would make the rabbinic loophole in making that possible. But we also, yeah, Stuart. Oh, you're muted. Wait, Stuart, you're muted.
Must all the grains, I'm sorry, be included? Wouldn't that be to have more than one grain? Wouldn't that be kind of comparable to growing more than one grain in the same field, which is forbidden?
That's a really good question. It doesn't seem, if I read this on the surface, I'll put it back up there. On the surface read of this text, it seems to just say that challah can only, these are the 5 things that can be used in challah. But it doesn't say specifically in other places where there does say you can't combine things together. It doesn't use the language of combination here, which would be a language that sages would use. Yes.
I have a question too.
Please.
So first of all, it doesn't say anything about additives. You can add stuff like sugar and eggs, right? But as long as. But my other question: isn't it possible that black bread would qualify as challah?
Yes, if it fits into wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye. As long as it's made from.
Have that particular. It doesn't have to necessarily be braided or whatever. It's really.
No. Challah is that which is taken. So if you make a loaf of bread, right? If you made a French bread, okay, and you removed, and it's made with one of these ingredients, you removed the challah, the piece, you dedicated it with a blessing, you said the bracha, you baked it, right? You could make motzi on Shabbat and call your challah French bread.
Thank you.
Right? There would be nothing that would be problematic about that. Now, the one thing we do know is there's this idea of Hidur Mitzvah. Hidur Mitzvah is sort of beautifying or glorifying the mitzvah. Okay, so if you have a mitzvah and you can do it with greater beauty, we should, right? Which is why you don't need a decorated Torah, but we do because we can. So if you have the opportunity to have decorative challah, then that would be preferable. Especially if it was separate or different from your daily bread, for example. Does that make sense? Yeah, Nancy.
I have a different question. You go back to that reading, I'm confused. I thought you had to have more than one because it talks about their combining. It says they join with each other to complete the minimum measurement required for challah.
Yeah, but the same way.
So part of this is talking in the different Mishnayot that come after this about how much you have to eat. Whereas like on Passover, we have a certain amount of matzo we have to eat. On Shabbat too, there's also a certain amount of challah. I didn't put that in here that one should eat to fulfill their challah obligation. When it says join together, I think it's the way I read it is one of the joining together is your separation and that it has one of these ingredients.
How does join together mean separation? I don't understand.
They are obligated in. I see the English problem here. This is the challenge with reading this in English, and I didn't bring the Hebrew. Let's not get hung up on it, but it's a good question. But you do not have to have a bread. I mean, clearly, right? Our challah doesn't have wheat, barley, spelt, oats, and rye in it all at once. So let's just let that sit. Okay.
Quick question.
Yes.
Can you fulfill the mitzvah of matzah at Passover with all of these, including oat?
Yes.
Or does it have to be wheat?
No, you eat one of these 5.
Any one of these 5?
Yes.
Okay. So there's your gluten free.
Oh, right. Spelt.
Right.
Right.
And oats.
No. The oat. Spelt is a
Oh.
grain, but oats are gluten-free.
Tells you what I know. My mother is gluten-free, and don't tell her that I don't know. All right, so here we go. So now here's a question. Do you know the famous story? Why do we cover the challah? Does anybody know? Does anybody know why we cover the challah? Why we teach children why we cover the challah?
Won't be jealous.
Yes.
Wine.
Because it comes in the final blessing, we cover the challah. Therefore, its feelings are we put it away before it's not jealous that the wine gets blessed first. Let me show you another reason. In Exodus chapter 16, it says, "In the evening, quail appeared and covered the camp. In the morning, there was a fall of dew about the camp. When the fall of dew lifted there over the surface of the wilderness lay a fine and flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, 'What is it?' For they did not know what it was. And Moses said to them, 'This is the bread which the Lord your God has given you to eat.'"
That's manna.
That is manna. But why, according to this, would we cover the challah?
Because the dew covered it?
Yes. And so when we cover the challah, we're not doing it because it's embarrassed, although that's a nice way to say it. We're doing it because we're modeling what happens each day that the Israelites got to experience the manna. And if you had 2 chalot and you had covered it and you were ready to bless it, you would take off the dew and you would find the flaky and fine substance that lie underneath it. This is there's not a lot of conversation here that needs to be had. But again, if we're gonna cover it, there's this Hidur Mitzvah, which is why you have these beautiful and intricate challah covers, in part because it represents the dew that was found on the ground. All right, so we're gonna go back to grain offerings. And Carol, you mentioned salt. Carol, will you read this, Exodus chapter 2?
Leviticus.
Sure. It is Leviticus. I know. "Do not omit from your grain offerings the salt of the covenant with your God. With all your offerings, you shall offer salt."
Okay, and so with every offering that we give to God, if challah is an offering, right? If we're having grain and we're dedicating it in some capacity, all the grain offerings in the temple had with it salt. Okay, so is this new to anybody that the challah and salt go together?
No.
Raise your hand. Yeah, it's okay for some. Challah and salt go together for lots of different reasons. You could have lots of different midrashic explanations about the sweetness of Shabbat, but also tapering it with the salt. But here it is simply a manifestation and continuation of the temple ritual of grain offerings come with salt. So great, kind of like who cares? We don't connect to the temple offering. So Isaac Luria had a little bit of a different idea of how we can think about this salt. If we're going to use salt, we have to think about it in a different way.
Yeah, this is it.
Bruce, you want to read this?
Oh, sure. Thanks. I was remembering this about not covering the bread with salt, but instead dipping the salt. Okay. Bread and salt are both representations of the divine. Salt is divine severity, and bread is divine kindness. We seek to overpower the severity of the salt with the kindness of the bread. Therefore, our custom is not to sprinkle the salt on the bread, but instead to dip the bread into the salt, kindness over severity.
So if you have to, thank you, if you have to dip, if bread goes with salt, if a grain offering goes with salt, we don't pour the salt on top of the bread, right? We dip it. Why? Because we are putting more kindness. If salt represents severity and the bread represents kindness, we want to take the kindness in our hands and just dab it a little bit in the salt, in the severity. Now, two things to make note here that are kind of interesting. This Hebrew word is lechem, and this Hebrew word is melach. Okay, this is a little, you can play a little midrashic game on this, but it's the same three letters. Mem lamed chet mem. So there's some linking here between kindness, divine kindness, and divine severity. What do you think that's about? And what can we do with that? What can we learn from that for Shabbat? Any ideas? Deborah?
That you need a balance of the two. It's just like with justice and mercy. You can't judge with either one of them alone because you wouldn't get a fair decision. You have to do it with both and temper one with the other. And so the severity, it has to be balanced, and we need to do that somehow.
Thank you. Ronnie?
Well, I think it represents life, kindness and severity. We both receive blessings and we face adversity. I also love the idea of dipping because it reminds me of the dipping in Pesach. We dip twice during Pesach. And it is this idea, I think, of ritual ablution. It's really about an act of moving to a higher level, getting purer, or being open to different things. But I do think it represents life. And I also think that the salt reminds me of the salt of the sea in a place of birth, and bread is about nurturance and growth.
Oh, I like that. I like that a lot. Thank you. The other thing, I was just going to respond to one thing you just said, but it's escaping me. It will come back. Carol.
So I'm going to take Ronnie's idea and blow it up even more, which is, it reminds me of the gifts that we bring when somebody moves into a new home. So we bring either flour or bread, we bring sugar, and we bring salt. So the flour and bread is for a whole life, the sugar is for a sweet life, and the salt is for an interesting or a spicy life. Again, the whole idea of that's what life is about. And the other comment is salt is a preservative. So in temple times, it was used on everything as a preservative. But now, maybe one way to think about it is by adding salt to things, we're preserving life, we're extending life, we're making life a little more interesting, God willing.
I like that. Thank you. Ronnie, I just remembered, on Passover, we say on all other nights we dip. How many times? One time. So there's an example of the way in which that you could say on Passover, when you say that, you could say, oh yeah, on Shabbat, I dip it in salt. There you go. Nancy.
Salt is also necessary for life. We need salt to live. People get dehydrated, they have to take salt pills. And so they're both bread and salt are necessary for life. And we need them both, but they're different aspects of that.
Thank you.
I can't help but thinking that the bread and salt can be used as a metaphor for the kind of days we're going through now. The COVID is definitely the salt aspect of life, but I think if we've learned anything going through these months, especially but not exclusively as a TBE community, is that kindness really ameliorates the harshness of the severity. And so we look at these things, we study things from the Talmud, and we're always finding some relevance. It's amazing.
Yeah, thank you for saying that. That's definitely true in lots of ways. The one other thing which is not related to what you just said, Nancy, but there is a custom that during one's first year of marriage, you relinquish the dipping in salt and instead you dip in honey. which is a pretty neat thing. But like, you know, after a year and a day, you go back to salt. That needs more explanation to me. But there is a custom for some to do that as well, which is sort of something about sweetness, which I think is quite nice as well. So let's think about this. Does anybody have any final thoughts on challah? Danny, and then I want to bring all three together.
Yeah, I just wanted to take the logical next step on the kindness bit, which is, I think there is a lesson here that one could take, which is that we actually have a spiritual obligation to dip the kindness in the salt in the world, which makes it less about the you know, it takes a little bit of both that Deborah described, although I like that metaphor as well. But, you know, in terms of what we take for ourselves, you know, we're reminded on Shabbat to be actively spreading the kindness rather than spreading the salt. And that feels like a lovely sacred obligation.
Yeah, I like that a lot, that we're not spreading the salt over it, but we're actually taking bits of the kindness and putting it all over the place. Literally, I guess, if you look at the floor after the table, after you eat a piece of challah, right, that there is an abundance of, at times, at least in my house, an abundance of kindness all over the place, right? So like, let's think about this in all three. We sit at the Shabbat table, we light our candles, we're bringing in the gift of Shabbat. We're saying thank you to the goodness of being able to participate in this sacred act, right? This is a gift. We're bringing it in, it's a light. It's illuminating our souls and it's illuminating the world. We then sit down and we have a glass of grape juice or wine or whatever it is that we're partaking in. And as we hold it, we are saying, this is the fulfillment of freedom and creation, that I'm here and I have the ability to do this. I remember what it was like in Egypt, and I am sitting here as this person who has the ability to celebrate Shabbat and the ability to bring out the light in the world. And then we figure out, okay, well, what is it that I have to do? In some sense, it's share. It's share the gift with other people, right? Through bringing the divine around the world, around us, through the sustenance that we're bringing to other people. It's the kindness that we're taking in ourselves and bringing out into the world. And it's the ability to recognize how far and how hard we have worked to bring this grain into something that can nourish us on our table. And so to me, if you look at Shabbat, at least the Shabbat table rituals with that lens, it's much greater than walking through 3 blessings really quickly in order to get to our dinner. So how do we share that? How do you guys think about that?
What's interesting, because the same way we've all talked about, you know, what Marlene, you were talking about your grandmother's blessing. Somebody else was talking about seeing her father dipping. I guess the only way we can do this is by doing these kinds of things and explaining them as we do them to other and future generations. So next time I have Shabbat with my grandchildren, which I hope will be soon, we're going to do something new, and maybe we'll make challah. And you know, my grandmother would never put a little piece aside, but I think we will do that now, and we'll dip it. We never dipped before, you know. I can't imagine our floor would look like yours, or the dog would eat it. But you know, I think that's about the only way that we could get these traditions known. Yeah, because a lot of them have been forgotten or used in a very different way. So we have to start explaining them, learning about them ourselves, and explaining them to others.
Yeah, it's so easy to see how rituals like this can just be moved to a different understanding, right? Or that these rituals become a means to sitting down with our family, which is not a problem, right? At all. But it is something that can deepen that experience.
Exactly.
And I think that is what we're trying to do. So if you haven't lit Shabbat can,
you know, just as we talked about, the holding of the cup is so different, right? You know, it's different and interesting and difficult for some people to hold a cup like this. that requires some kind of an explanation
Mm-hmm.
for everyone who's at that table.
Right. So our goal for this week, yes, Jerry.
It just makes me take pause to think. My big question was, who knew? I didn't know a lot of what we've discussed. And now I take a step back and really see the importance of this. And I think I'll look at it a bit differently from now on as we face Shabbat. So thank you, Philip,
Well, thank you.
this was an interesting series of conversations we've had.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Thank you, Bonnie.
I was just going to say that I can't sit here and not say thank you to Temple Beth Elohim for another reason. My grandchildren have learned how to bake challah at Temple. And I used to bake a challah every single Shabbat. And when my children left home and I was alone, I didn't do it anymore. But I now have Tanya and Alex every Friday baking a challah. And now we're exchanging recipes and I'm starting to bake challahs again. So there are so many ways that the reinforcement and the love get shared and we reignite each other, especially when we're lucky enough to have grandchildren at Temple Beth Elohim. So thank you.
It's really sweet, Bonnie. Thank you for sharing.
So
So
a
I
question
hope
about
that,
challah.
yeah.
I don't know if this has been discussed yet, but why is it braided? And why is the number of braids variable?
That's a great question. I don't know the answer. I don't know the answer. I mean, I don't know.
Because I know it can be 3 braids, 5 braids, 7 braids.
6 braids. I saw last week there was a menorah, a Chanukiah challah. I mean, I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. My guess is largely it's minhag. Scott, did you? Wait, you're muted, Scott. But still.
I had heard when some people break challah and some people slice it. I heard you're not supposed to slice the challah. Is that true?
So again, this is minhag, customs that different people had. There are families that rip and there are families that slice. There are families that rip, but also there's some, my grandfather always took the challah, the second challah, and put the knife over it, but didn't cut it, and then cut the other challah. And I never actually understood why. These are great questions. Bruce, I'm gonna have to look into that and see where the minhag comes from. Deborah, and then,
Two
and
things.
then we'll
I
wrap
think
up. Mhm.
Some of the minhag for that and not cutting is because cutting is more, well, warlike or work, and we don't do that on Shabbat, so that, while arguably ripping is one of the 39 too, it's less than the other. But also in terms of the braiding, you were talking about the challah as separating, so that perhaps you're separating the dough into pieces and then braiding it over each other. So that kind of plays on that. And then it's just beautiful. It's Hidur, it's another way to make the mitzvah beautiful.
Yeah. Carol, go ahead.
I had also learned originally that the challah were, there were 3 braids, 3 strands that were braided, and they were braided 4 times. And that made the 12 curves on top, and that was the 12 tribes of Israel.
Yeah, that could very well be. That's like a breastplate. That would be also, that would work. So good questions, lots to uncover. We don't know it all, and I look forward to studying more with you all. So a couple, I have 3 announcements. One, be on the lookout in terms of challah. We're gonna do some challah baking classes in the winter and spring. So be on the lookout, whether that's Thursday afternoon, Thursday night, or Friday morning. I'm not sure, but we're gonna be doing that to hope they get more people baking challah. That's one. starting next Monday night for the next 2 weeks, if you'd like to join me, I'd love to study with you. We're going to look at text around Hanukkah, looking at text on darkness and finding light. And so that'll be Monday at 7 o'clock. We're doing a community-wide candle lighting, and there's a social justice teaching, but we'll come together for about 45 minutes at 8 o'clock. Next Monday night, and then on the 14th, and then 45 minutes on Monday at 8 o'clock on the 21st. So those are the first two announcements. The second is, if you haven't heard, there's a class called Rescuing Hope, which is an intergenerational learning experience exploring the Holocaust, specifically resistance and resiliency. And there are a few of you here who've already signed up. And there are a few of our alum in our class, Howard and Nancy and Gloria, who have participated last year. And it is an extraordinary opportunity to truly engage with teens in our community and adults of all ages. And so I hope that if you are interested in exploring this class, it's going to be on Sundays. There's about 10 Sundays. We're hoping that you can come to most of them between 4 and 5, beginning in January. If you're interested in learning more, please let me know. It's not open to everyone, and you can't come in mid-course. And so if you are interested, I would love to continue to expand the group with thoughtful thinkers like you all. So if you're interested, please send me an email and I can share more information. It was also in yesterday's e-blast, if you take a look at that. All right. And I'm sure Gloria and Nancy and Howard would be happy to share about their experiences as well. So
yeah, if
Can I
you
make a
can
quick
do it,
announcement?
if you can do it, you should. It's a fantastic opportunity. I think we were honored to do it.
Thanks,
Sign
Nancy.
up before all the spaces are gone.
Yes. Danny, last word.
Sure. If you are looking to light candles at a different moment in time than in the evening, join us on Sunday at 1:30 as we light candles with our sister congregation, Ohel Avraham in Haifa. Shauna will be joining us, as well as Nama and Gabi from Ohel Avraham, and many of our friends in Haifa. So join us.
Awesome. I wish you all a Chag Sameach. May you find ways to spread the light and publicize the light in all the ways that are meaningful to you and your families. Chag Sameach. And eat a donut. All right.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Philip.
Bye. Thank you guys. Good night.
Thank you.